Hello and welcome to Reader 2 Standing By. This is your host, Wedge, and I have with me.
Wraith 14, remembered to say it this time.
And we're coming at you for episode 3. This time, we are finishing up the X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series with Volume 3 of the New Republic Epic Collection. This collects issues 17 through 35 of the original X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series. And we're also going to touch briefly on the X-Wing Rogue Squadron Handbook, which is collected in a couple other trades and omnibuses, but as we will discuss later, it's not too big a deal that it's not included in these two trades, even though I think it would have made most sense to be added here. So let's get started with our briefing, which is our new, we've developed segment titles for our discussions, and the briefing is where we provide context for what stories we're talking about, because we got some listener feedback to our first episode that said a lot of people don't necessarily know what it was like in terms of both in the universe and in our world when these stories were released. So these stories were released between March 1997 and November 1998. During this publication time, all 4 original X-Wing novels had concluded. They stopped in January of 1997, and Wraith Squadron wouldn't come out till February of 1998. So these were the only X-Wing stories being released for about 13 months. The first 2 Wraith Squadron books were published during the last year of this comic's publication, leading to some letters in the last few issues of the comic about Baron Fel, because he was appearing in the Wraith Squadron novels in a very different context than he appears in the Rogue Squadron comics. So that was kind of fun. And if you ever get a copy of those old X-Wing comics, you can see the letters and how fans were responding to the comics, and that's pretty fun. I don't think, unfortunately, they've ever been collected, but if you find original copies of the individual issues, you'll see those. I, Jedi by Mike Stackpole was also published in May of 1998, just 4 months after Wraith Squadron, and it ties heavily into the Admiral Leonia Tavira sections of this comic, and of course, last month's comics. During this period of time is when the first trade paperbacks started to be released. They skipped, as we mentioned, the Rebel Opposition completely. It was never collected until the Dark Horse Comics Omnibus. So Phantom Affair came out in November of 1997, which was 1.5 years from the release of the actual Phantom Affair in the comics. And that's usually trades come out between 6 months and a year of the original comics. So these days there is a problem with trades coming out on time. Collection departments for DC and Marvel and Image are not on the ball all the times. But this was the mid-90s, and trade paperbacks were not common. It was actually kind of unusual that all of the rest of the X-Wing series got collected, and they were actually pretty cool collections because they would include secondary stories that often weren't available on the main market, and introductions and behind-the-scenes sketches. So they were actually pretty good trades. The 4 trades that make up this collection were released from 1998 to 2000, which meant that mandatory retirement wasn't collected for a full 2 years after its issues ended. So if you were a trade waiter, you had no idea what was happening for quite a while. Especially since I was definitely a trade waiter. I didn't really know much about the comics until probably about 2005. I read Isard's Revenge when it came out in 1999, and so that story, which we'll cover later in the podcast, wraps up a ton of the storylines, and I had never read Mandatory Retirement, so I was very confused. Yes.
I was just waiting for you to kind of get through all the history part.
Yep. So the original Dark Horse Omnibus came out in 2007, and the Marvel Epic Collection, which I have, came out in 2017. So about 10 years apart after, of course, Disney bought Star Wars. The Epic was divided into two, and the omnibuses were divided into three. So there actually were different selections. So Requiem for a Rogue was originally part of the second volume of the big collections. And in this collection that we're talking about is the first one here. The last three arcs, In the Empire's Service, Masquerade, and Mandatory Retirement, are part of what we call the Rise of Isard. The character of Isan Isard appears in this sequence chronologically for the first time in the X-Wing series, although later on Isard would continue appearing in novellas such as Interluded Darknell and the comic series Agent of the Empire. So she actually appears several times before this. Oh, and Marjade by the Emperor's Hand. But in the X-Wing series, this is the first time we see her.
Do you want to talk about your reading these first, or I can?
Yes. Well, actually, since I've been giving all the history, why don't you go ahead and talk about you first reading these, and then I'll give mine.
So I was reading them probably when I was 8 or 9. So that's like around 2000. And my library had a pretty good selection of them. I really remember Battleground Tatooine from the previous podcast and the Rise of Izard ones we were talking about. I probably read Requiem for a Rogue, but didn't really remember it that much. But yeah, one thing I mentioned in the show notes on these is we were cleaning out the attic a few years ago, house I grew up in, and found this old drawing of the Battle of Brental, which we'll talk about later.
That's very cool.
Was cool, good, art-wise, probably not, but I was young.
I mean, around the same time, I was drawing pictures of the Battle of the Thera with the burnt-out hulk of the Lusankia with my little pencil as like a 6-year-old. So, no, I wasn't 6. I was 11 or 12, but not a very good artist. I was reading 1 or 2 of the individual issues of Masquerade and Mandatory Retirement at the library as they came out, and this was as they came out, but I had no context. I think I just read the last issue of Masquerade, the first and third and fourth issues of Mandatory Retirement. So these big gaps. So the plot often feels disjointed, and that's not the comic's fault. That's just because I read them out of order. I actually read a single issue of Requiem for a Rogue a couple years earlier. It's the issue where Nrin flies his X-Wing as a land speeder assault in the ground attack, and that really left an impression on me. Plus, it also had Tycho's Nightmare in it.
That image.
I wouldn't read the whole series until 2011. So I was often in the dark about a lot of the connections to the novels, even though I knew the comics existed. During this time, from early 1997 to late 1998, the third X-Wing game, X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, was released in April 1997. And remember, these comics and the novels are actually part of the licensed tie-ins to the video games, not the movies. The campaign for X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter Balance of Power was released in December of 1997, and then fall 1998. All 3 of the games so far were released in the Collector Series CD-ROM version, because before they were on floppy disk, of course. This is ancient history, guys.
I mean, my first computer was Windows 3.1, so...
I don't think I owned a computer until I went to college in 2004, and that one had... Which one? That wouldn't be 98, would it? It would be... It wasn't Millennium Edition. It was the one after that. XP. It was Windows XP I had.
Well, yeah, my dad worked at a place where I think he got like the laptop through work. Of course, it was ancient by that point.
Ah, I see. So it's not that you actually got the computer in the late 90s.
Oh no.
It's that it was from the late 90s.
Let's see. Yeah, Windows 3.1 was like introduced in '92, so
Right.
it's not a late '90s thing.
Well, I mean, it lasted until around 98, I think, when they released 98. So technically, it could go into the late 90s.
Yeah, it just wasn't new when I had it by any stretch of the imagination. But
No.
we're getting sidetracked. Yeah, I didn't really get into the Star Wars games until like post 2000. So then it was a lot of Battlefront. But
Yeah. Did you ever play those X-Wing TIE Fighter and X-Wing versus TIE Fighter?
I think so. But a lot of the games I had were like originally out of the library, and then we were actually able to buy Battlefront. I remember there's some game that I played that I can't tell what it was I was playing anymore. It might have been Empire at War, but yeah, I didn't get into those mid '90s ones.
I
'Cause of the
loved them,
timing.
but I couldn't play them because my parents wouldn't let us because they didn't want to have to buy a computer that had all the graphics cards and stuff. I played X-Wing versus TIE Fighter and X-Wing at a friend's house. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever, but I never owned it. We played a little bit of... Yeah, no, that was all we played. We got some of the games much, much later in the early 2000s, but only at a friend's house I played them. But I thought they were the coolest ever, especially because I was reading the books at the time. There was a real sense that this era of Star Wars was winding down and we were getting ready for something new. Because the Timothy Zahn Hand of Thrawn novels, Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future, were coming out at this time in 1997 and 1998. And they served as a season finale for what we call the Bantam era, because Bantam was the publisher that got the contract from Lucasfilm, and they were changing to Del Rey, which was a different publisher.
Yeah, Adamar was the last of the Bantam books, right?
I can't remember if it's Adamar or Tales from the New Republic. It's one of those.
And, well, the funny thing is Adamar takes something that was set up very briefly in Hand of Thrawn and explains how it came to be, but we'll talk about that later.
We will talk about that, and that will be a wonderful episode because Adamar is one of the best Star Wars books ever, and I would argue a really great book too. But we want to give that its full justice, so we're just gonna keep focusing on the X-Wing Rogue Squadron comics for this episode. There was one more X-Wing game coming out, X-Wing Alliance, the Rogue Squadron series of console games for, I think, the N64 and then the Game Boy? No, GameCube. The GameCube. Those eventually made it to computer, but they were mostly console, so I played them once, I think, as a kid. But they were very popular. It's kind of a bummer that they weren't able to talk to Stackpole and Alston to sort of make them connect more, because it would have been cool to see Case and Moore in the books and comics, or to see Tycho in the games, but there wasn't really that connectivity, unfortunately. In the wider Star Wars comics world, we're just going to give some brief context. Dark Horse was doing a bunch of smaller projects like Boba Fett with Dark Empire artist Cam Kennedy, some special edition movie comics, because this, of course, was when the special edition movies were coming out because The Phantom Menace was delayed. And they were wrapping up the Tales of the Jedi series, which was released in miniseries by Kevin J. Anderson and Tom Veitch, the Dark Empire guy. This is also the time when the Crimson Empire, the first two miniseries, were released. And, of course, Mike Stackpole went from the X-Wing series to the Mara Jade by the Emperor's Hand miniseries, collaborating with Timothy Zahn. And as I mentioned, Isard also appears in that, so there's a strong X-Wing connection there. So there really was a sense of the comics trying to have that same connectivity that some of the novels did, although they didn't do as much connecting with the novels themselves until later.
Was the Union part of that?
Union, I think, was in mid 1998 because it had to come out after Vision of the Future, but it wasn't much after.
Wikipedia says November to February 99 to February 2000. So
yeah, that sounds about right. So it actually was about a year later. The big thing is that 1 month, just about 1 month after Rogue Squadron ended as an ongoing series, they launched the Star Wars series, which was later retitled Republic. And that was the prequel era characters. So Ki-Adi-Mundi and Quinlan Vos and, of course, Anakin and Qui-Gon. So there's a real sense to me that they were shifting their focus from after the original trilogy to setting up the prequel trilogy. Just to sort of give a sense of where this was coming from in terms of comics and Star Wars release in general. So that's where these comics come. They're basically right before the prequels come out. But of course, they're prequels to the Rogue Squadron novels themselves. Later, this was quite a while later, like in the 2010s, they released individual issues of a couple of these stories as comic packs with action figures. So there was one with Baron Fell and Hobby, and there was another one with Wedge in dress uniform and Borsk Phalia. I actually have owned both in the past, but I don't own the Baron Fell and Hobby figures anymore. I recently, well, a couple of years ago, I bought the Wedge and Phalia one, but I really don't like the Wedge because his head is kind of tilted outwards, so he looks like he's always looking upwards. So it's not super well made, unfortunately. But it is cool that they made an explicitly expanded universe character with the Starfighter dress uniform, which is very cool looking.
Wasn't there a different Fell and Isard one too, or was that different?
Was there?
I know the action figures are out there. I don't know if they were part of the comic back or not.
There might have been.
They came as a duo because I see them on eBay.
Yeah. I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be too surprised. Those are just the two I happen to know because I've owned them in the past. But there were probably 10 or 12 of these expanded universe, and always, of course, from the comics, which is much easier to draw from because it's a visual thing instead of going straight from a novel. Although they do have those micro machines from a novel, which are very cool. I really wish they'd done a wide release of the second volume and gone on to a third volume and maybe get some X-Wing micro machines, because that would have been cool to have little corn horns and little Keltainers. That brings us, I think that gives a pretty good picture of the context of when these were released. In our universe. In universe for Star Wars, these comics, again, take place basically right after the Truce at Baccarat and before X-Wing Rogue Squadron. But they end about a year to a year and a half before X-Wing Rogue Squadron, the first novel that Mike Stackpole released. And that's to leave a lot of room for a bunch of stuff that has to happen before the actual X-Wing novels happen. Because there's such a big space there, we also got the Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor novel in, I think, 2008, which was released, and that was written by Matthew Stover, and it takes place basically a couple months after mandatory retirement. And of course, Hobby is a viewpoint character in that, and they mention Phalis, and I think they mention Avon, but I'm not sure. I have a lot of salt about that. I think I mentioned that it features TIE Defenders long before they're supposed to appear. Although you could make an argument that since Corran isn't there, you could still say it's not technically breaking canon, but it's the kind of thing that just didn't need to happen.
I haven't read it, so.
Well, I am unusual in Star Wars fans in not generally liking Matthew Stover's work or writing that much. He's very talented. I'm not saying he's bad. I just do not enjoy it and don't like it and disagree with a lot of the creative and world building choices he makes. So I don't recommend it. If you have limited reading time, there are many other books, like the X-Wing books, that I would recommend instead. That brings us, I think, to the end of our briefing. Let's get to the mission and summarize our stories. We have 6 story arcs here. So why don't you get started by summarizing briefly in a few sentences Requiem for a Rogue.
Okay, so this one got a bit unusual. It follows the rogues going in search of a missing ship, all or mainly Bothans. And
well, only Bothans are survivors. There may have been other characters, but they're all dead now.
Yeah, so this missing ship, and it ends up on a planet that had some sort of like dark side temple thing, source of dark side power that then gets used by former like Imperial clerk type of guy who reminded me of somebody in Darksaber, but I won't go into that. Deveronian, unusually, so non-human. And then one of the Bothan leaders gets twisted by the dark side and does strange feats like shoot his own hand off and reattach it. It got a little weird for a Rogue Squadron story.
Very
but in the end, defeating the enemy and their force-controlled TIE fighters requires the sacrifice of 2 rogues, one of whom had really been around through the previous comics, Delur, and then the other one is a Bith woman whose name I don't know how you pronounce.
I always say Harrian.
Harrian. And with the force being strong in this one location, at the end, you see their sort of force ghosts watching as the rogues leave safely.
And there's also a lot of nightmares that reveal backstory and fears of a lot of the rogues, especially Nrin and Ibtissim and Tycho. They have
especially Tycho.
Yeah, Tycho's dream is amazing. He dreams that he betrays Princess Leia to Grand Moff Tarkin, even though that obviously couldn't have happened because he didn't know Princess Leia until after he defected from the Empire. But he fears that he would have, and that bit of character just gives Tycho so much depth to me. Is he used to be a fully sold out Imperial, and now he's a fully sold out Rebel, and so he has to grapple with that change and what it means.
And that is a theme in several of these stories that we'll get to next.
Yes, because our next story, In the Empire's Service, features the creation of the Empire's Red Baron, also known as Baron Soontir Fel, a Corellian farm boy who is the best pilot in the Empire. So good that Darth Vader created his TIE Advanced by 1 so that he didn't keep getting shot down by Baron Fel in simulators.
And Fel had taught Tycho, Hobby, and Big Starklighter, and they were never able to shoot him down. And
he trained them at Karita, which, of course, was exploded in the Jedi Academy trilogy. He also trained alongside Han Solo, and this appeared in the Han Solo trilogy by Anne Crispin, and he also trained with Loka Hask, the murderer of Wedge's parents. So lots of connections both to Jedi Academy trilogy and to the Han Solo trilogy, and, of course, to these X-Wing Rogue Squadron comics themselves.
I was actually going to mention Han Solo. So here, it's an interesting bit of real world timing. But I think, well, so in the Han Solo trilogy, I don't know if it was something Crispin was told not to write or if she just didn't, but it skips over most of Han's time in the Imperial Academy.
She was
So
told she couldn't.
That's what I thought. So you don't see Fel there, but in the climactic battle of the second book, Fel is present, which is referenced in the comics. And the interesting thing is, In the Empire Service was first published on August 6th, 1997. And then Hutt Gambit, the second Han Solo trilogy book, gets published 5 days later with Fel in it, which is something Crispin had talked to Stackpole about. You know, do you have a character in mind that could fit into this? And Stackpole mentions Fel, and the rest is history.
I really love those publishing connections and correlations. And also, of course, Timothy Zahn was friends with Stackpole at this time, and he was calling him up, and they were calling each other about their characters. And Timothy Zahn would turn out to use Baron Fel quite heavily in a lot of his later Star Wars books, especially Vision of the Future. He also appears as the main character of the novella Crisis of Faith, which appears in the Heir to the Empire 20th Anniversary Edition, published, of course, in 2011. Yeah, that's 20 years. Trying to do math in my head is hard sometimes. But anyway, so In the Empire Service covers the lead up and battle of the planet of Brental, specifically the fourth. Is it the moon or the planet? Brental 4?
It looks like the planet.
Well, I mean, so does Endor, though, and we know Endor is a moon.
Wow.
It's like Titan of Jupiter. It's so big, it's basically the size of Earth. Anyway, the Battle of Brental 4, which, of course, is Rogue Squadron's first move into the core. So before this point, they've basically been doing scattered missions, developing support, and rescuing personnel throughout the sort of mid-region, mid-rim. And of course, this is anachronistic because the map of the galaxy wasn't developed till the early 2000s, and this is the late 90s. So it's still very nebulous where planets are in relation to each other. But we did know at this time that there was something called the Galactic Core and Coruscant, which is what we called it back then because the Phantom Menace hadn't come out yet. Coruscant was in the Galactic Core. And we knew from Wedge's Gamble that Rogue Squadron would have to capture it. But to get there, you had to have staging points. And Brental was one of the main staging points from which they were able to continue building up forces in bases and then launching them to Coruscant. This is the first time in the comics that we see General Horton Salm, the Y-Wing pilot, and although he's a colonel and he gets promoted at the end of this story to general, he is the leader of Aggressor Wing, right? Isn't that what we see?
Yes.
Yeah, Aggressor Wing, which is a bunch of Y-Wings, which are all the BTL Bs with the rear gunners, because turrets with ion cannons are extremely important plot points in this arc, because one of them shoots Baron Fel as he and Wedge are dogfighting for their lives. General Salm's gunner manages to shoot Baron Fel with an ion cannon, and they capture him.
Was it Salm's gunner, or did Salm just get in the back?
Well, it was the ion cannon, so it had to be the gunner.
Wow. Yeah.
And we see that Salm, the Y-Wing is pointed away, and the gunner is shooting sort of diagonally through the back of the Y-Wing, because the Y-Wing got shot by Baron Fel, but is still alive, so it's able to tag him with the ion cannon. Baron Fel's capture, I'm going to run through the next arc as well, because it's basically sort of one part. You get one issue that's called The Making of Baron Fel, and that is the story of how Baron Fel went from farm boy to Imperial Ace, and how he fell in love with Wedge's sister, Sile Antilles, who went by the holo name Winsa Starflare, as a famous actress. And they got married, and Baron Fel was trained by Grand Admiral Thrawn and had run-ins with Darth Vader and all these rebels, and his career as it relates to the Battle of Endor, the destruction of Alderaan, Battle of Yavin, Battle of Dara 4, which was it was planned by Thrawn and executed by the 181st, and then his moving around after the Empire's death. At the end of the making of Baron Fell, he says he will defect to the New Republic if they help him find his wife, Wedge's sister. So in Family Ties, Wedge sends Hobby, Wes Jansen, and Plur to Corellia to try and find Sile, where they meet Corran Horn and Iello Wasiri, who are Corsac agents at the time. They also meet, of course, Curtin Lur, Budget Tarkin, the Imperial liaison, and they have a whole adventure where they rescue a kid. They unfortunately don't find Sile, but that leads us to Masquerade. And how about you give us a quick run through of Masquerade?
So the most memorable part of Masquerade for me is that no one can tell whether Winter is Leia or not, including Han Solo and Taika Waititi, who are at this point the romantic partners of Leia and Winter. There's
to be fair, Winter is wearing a wig in this one.
Yeah, there's a whole scene where Leia and Taika are talking about Winter, and Leia is kind of like, oh, she mentioned you, but it was only in passing, but that's good. And then it turns out Leia was Winter all along. Which we find out when Leia, air quotes, suddenly kisses Taika. So, yeah, that happened. But in Masquerade, the reason for that whole ruse is Winter is publicly appearing as Leia so that Leia in secret can meet with the leader de facto of the Empire, Sate Pestage, who's sort of like the kind of random guys following Palpatine around in Return of the Jedi, and is taking over after Endor. But in reality, there's a military ruling council and Yasin Isard, who are both maneuvering for control. Isard is trying to pit those two groups against each other, and Pestage, realizing where things are headed, wants to cut a deal with the New Republic for immunity, several worlds for himself and his allies, and in return, he will give up Coruscant to the New Republic. So they're working out a deal over that, but it gets disrupted when a group working for pirates stuns Tycho and Winter, who they think is Leia. And then they're in captivity of Leonia Tavira, who appears in I, Jedi, pirate leader. And that sets Han, with Fell's help, to go and try and find out where Leia, who he thinks is Leia, has been taken. And along the way, they go to Iatu, where Plur is, I think.
And I'd say the bulk of the action happens on the planet Axila, which is basically, it's a city planet, but basically entirely run by criminals.
Yeah, that sounds kind of like Escape from New York.
When did that one come out?
Well, that was in like the very early 80s, but it's where the president's plane goes down over New York, and it's out of control, so they have to send Kurt Russell in to get him. But
I am sure that Mike Stackpole was a big fan of that movie and definitely was referencing it in Masquerade.
Yeah, so there's a lot of piracy hijinks. Tycho and Winter are breaking out of their prison and stealing a Y-Wing because it's the only two-seater, with jokes about how they wouldn't have minded a one-seater. And the rogues bail them out of being chased by the pirates. And all is well that ends well, except Isard knows what Sate Vestige is up to.
And that leads directly into Mandatory Retirement, which is the final arc in the series finale. And it really does feel like a big action adventure finale to the series, because the character of Admiral Dilak Krenel, one of the lackeys of the Empire, is sent to pursue Sate Vestige as he flees from Coruscant to his own planets of Sayutrik. And the rogues are sent to get him out from under Admiral Krenel's Star Destroyer and Interdictor Cruiser, which means they can't come in and out of the system with hyperspace. They have to figure out how to get out. So originally, to quickly run through the first few issues, the rogues actually start on leave for the entire first issue. They go on dates, they bond as friends, they exercise, they fight each other. In general, it's a really fun picture of the rogues as characters as you've come to love them. And then they're immediately plunged into this desperate mission where they are able to connect with Vestige on Sayutrik, but then the Star Destroyer and Interdictor Cruiser jump in and start dropping AT-ATs and stormtroopers all over the planet, and so they're forced to go underground. And one of the pilots, Ibtissim, the Mon Calamari pilot, is shot down, much to the dismay of her former rival and now love interest, Nurin Vakil, who is a Quarren, and that story of how they become love interests when their people tend to dislike each other is very Romeo and Juliet-esque. And we see hints of this in the Ahsoka TV show when Quarren and Mon Calamari are having a love affair and they get captured.
I think that was Mandalorian, not... Did you say Ahsoka?
Is it Mandalorian?
Yeah, because...
Oh, yeah, it was the Mandalorian. It was Bo-Katan's
former group is the one who catches them, yeah.
Right. I get all the Star Wars shows kind of mixed up because they all kind of look the same and they all happen at the same time. Anyway, they end up with the assistance of Mirex, who comes back for the first time since that second arc, Phantom Affair, and General Som's aggressor wing. They're able to punch through by collapsing the shields of the Interdictor Cruiser and firing on the Star Destroyer to convince those ships to draw back so they have enough time to escape. Unfortunately, Vestige betrays them and attempts to work with Krenel, but Krenel murders him and takes his planets, which has major repercussions several novels later in Isard's Revenge, but of course we'll talk about that later. And of course, Ibtissim has died of being shot down. And this leads to the ending scene of Wedge giving his eulogy for Ibtissim as all the rogues are in their dress whites.
There's also a really good scene where Vestige is reacting. Basically says he doesn't want to be in the cargo area with Ibtissim's body, and Wedge grabs him by the throat, slams against the wall, and threatens to go Vader on him. On the theme of dealing with past Imperial service, you also have Nurin trying to attack Vestige after they find out that Ibtissim didn't make it. And Fel stops him. Nurin is like, you're all have the same attitude, and Fel answers, not anymore. The rogues have changed me, type of thing.
It's a very moving scene. There's a lot of character development of Nurin himself and Baron Fel and just all the characters in general. It's really, I think Mandatory Retirement is an almost perfect comics finale. There's a couple plot threads that Stackpole wasn't able to finish or whatever just because of space or plot or editorial, but in general this wraps up pretty much all the main emotional threads and sets everything up for both the Rogue Squadron novel series and Isard's Revenge. And Isard's Revenge basically serves as the real ending to a lot of these plot points. But in terms of Wedge and the Squadron, they end in a place that is sad because it is funeral, but also hope because Stackpole gives Wedge a great speech about how Ibtissim died fighting for justice, freedom, and liberty. So that was very nice.
And Nurin also returns in Isard's Revenge
Yes.
And we find out later ends up marrying Cohen Comad, who is the mechanic after having appeared in the first few comics in Phantom Affair as like a waitress, college student. She's a mechanic for the Rogues, and her and Ren end up getting married by the time of New Jedi Order.
Yeah.
And we see a bit of her and Naren talking when he's worried about Imtisam having been shot down at a different point.
Yeah, in the Empire's service, Imtisam gets shot down and is part of a firefight with Commando leader Cap Dendo. And Naren is very anxious because this is when he's first starting to acknowledge that he has feelings for Imtisam, and he's struggling with, well, her species and my species don't like each other, but I really love her. And Koyu Komad slaps some sense into him. And I think that it's kind of nice that Alston and Stackpole took that connection between them and developed that and gave them some happiness. Because they're both really cool characters, and I'm glad that they end up together and have a good life.
And well, never mind. I was going to say something, but then I realized it's a spoiler for another book.
Well, that brings our mission to an end. Let's do our after-action report and do analyses of each of these books. What did we like? What didn't we like? What would we recommend? So let's start, of course, with Requiem for a Rogue.
If I had to rank one of these the lowest, it would probably be Requiem for a Rogue, just because that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just if I had to. The whole dark side thing felt really bizarre to me, as you probably noticed when I was trying to describe it.
A lot of very weird stuff happens, especially when the Bothan blows off his own hand and murders a dude, and then it reattaches. It's like super powerful Sith magic going on, and they explicitly call it magic. They don't call it dark side powers. So we could say, and I'm sure Michael Stackpole was banking on this. This is a specific thing to this temple, and that's why it's important that you destroy this temple so no one else can use these specific super powerful powers. I have a strange liking for Requiem for a Rogue. It's definitely weird, and the art by Gary Erskine, who's a really nice guy on Twitter. I do recommend, if you read Requiem for a Rogue, give him a shout out on Twitter. Say, I just read that; it was great. He'll really get a kick out of that. He's a very nice guy, and really he has very fond memories of working on the Rogue Squadron comics, and he talks about that on Twitter several times. But his stuff tends to be very kind of cold and scary, which I think is good for this arc. I'm glad he didn't do things like mandatory retirement or in the Empire's service, because I think those require a lot more emotional investment in a warm way. Whereas I think it works great for things like Tycho's Nightmare or just the sheer creepiness of the Sith Temple and the Sith magic. His art is perfect for that, but I don't think it would be as good for the more straightforward adventure or romantic stuff that happens later. I really like just all the character development. You have, I think we've mentioned this before, but this is where I think it really starts to show. Stackpole in his novels tends to really just focus on 2 or 3 characters, but in these comics, he's forced to really develop each character with more character moments. So Hobby and Wes have weird romances with the Bothan ladies, and Phalis is a great, she's a great tactical support. She's shown several times helping people in firefights and being backup as blaster. Tycho takes command after Wedge is shot down, and you really get to see him as a secondary commander, which I thought was really great, because he starts out the series very brash and kind of always wanting to fight, but he's really matured by this point, I think, and that really gives us that sense that he could become what he eventually is, which is the new leader of Rogue Squadron when Wedge is promoted to fleet command and does semi-retirement with architecture and blah, 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 whatever. But Tycho is great, and I love that we get to see him as a leader here in Requiem for a Rogue.
Yeah, they also have, you mentioned Phalis. She has a romance with Avon Barris.
Yeah, but that happens next arc, so we're not talking about that quite yet. I also really like the villains. Like the Bothans are really creepy, especially the leader, of course. And the tech is creepy enough. He's constantly, but I like that he's like stupid and competent. And unlike admirals and generals who are supposed to be competent, it makes sense because he's just a tech. He's the mechanic dude who tagged along with the Imperial occupation, but then stayed behind to control all the alien four-armed semi-intelligent. I think they're supposed to be basically as intelligent as dumber monkeys called the Irokeen. And so he takes control of them. But when the Bothan takes over, he's got basically martial arts called Jeswandi, which is very silly sounding, but he just takes control and has all this strategy. But the rogues are able to beat him by overwhelming him by having multiple attacks in multiple places. And so you see Wedge and Tycho's strategic capability throughout this issue. Plus, of course, Plur comes back and manages to add a whole flight of Z95 headhunters to the force. Any last thoughts on Requiem for a Rogue before we move on to In the Empire's Service?
Not really.
All right, let's move to In the Empire's Service. This, of course, is the Battle of Brental. Art was by John Nadeau, who I think drew the most issues of the series. He did Battleground Tatooine and Warrior Princess, as well as In the Empire's Service, and part of Mandatory Retirement. I love his space battles. I think he does a really good job of making X-Wings in combat with TIE fighters look really cool, and it never looks wonky. Like the perspectives on the X-Wings, they look like models. So I feel strongly that he got some models and like posed them with modeling clay or wires and then drew them.
Yeah, Nadeau is definitely my favorite artist of this series.
He also did he was inked by Jordi Ensign, who is also on Twitter. She's doing something completely. She's not in comics anymore, but she's on Twitter and she sometimes talks about that stuff. Inking is very important because penciling is very light and sometimes very loose. So an inker really tightens that up and makes it all consistent. It's similar to the animation process. We had animators who drew rough pencil from page to page as they were photographed and put in sequence. And then they had what are called cleanup artists or finishers who drew the thick lines that were always consistent from frame to frame. In the Empire's Service, of course, is the introduction of Baron Fel. And what did you think? Was this, when you read these comics, was this the first time you met Baron Fel, or did you meet Baron Fel, as I did, first in the, I think it was first in Wraith Squadron, and then in Vision of the Future?
I think it was comics first, but I can't say for sure. Although Fel only comes up in the first Wraith Squadron book very briefly at the end.
Yes, but he's a much bigger part of Iron Fist and of course Solo Command. But that's a huge plot line that we don't want to get too much into. But I definitely met him there. And I was reading those letters, as I mentioned, so I was like, I know exactly what they're talking about, because Fel in Wraith Squadron, as we mentioned, was working for Zinj, not even the Empire. He's working for a warlord, whereas here he defects to the New Republic. So there's a lot of questions about that, which are all answered, but we have to keep going to find those answers.
Well, sadly, the story of how Fel left Rogue Squadron was a story that Stackpole and I believe Zahn as well wanted to write, but were never able to publishing wise. So yeah, they that's wanted to a missing piece from after these comics.
Yeah, they collaborated on the Mara Jade comic series, which is really good. I definitely recommend it. It's not quite X-Wing enough for me to try and persuade Wraith to do a whole episode on it, but it's got a ton of ice art, of course, because she's a great rival of Mara for the Empire's power and the Emperor's favor. The Dark Horse wasn't willing to let Zahn and Stackpole do another miniseries like that, which I think they originally wanted to do. So I think they were going to try and do something like Side Trip and Interlude at Darknell, which were 4-chapter novellas that they did for the role-playing game, and they were collected in Tales from the Empire and Tales from the New Republic. And so they wanted to do another one of those since they couldn't do it in comics. But of course, the role-playing stuff had moved to a completely different licensor. It was no longer West End Games. And even though Stackpole and Zahn did a bunch of prequel short stories for the Star Wars Insider magazine and Star Wars Gamer magazine, so they were still connected to those gamer short story outlets, they were never able to convince editorial and licensing to let them do this specific story, which they called the re-enlistment of Baron Fell. And that's a real shame, because I think it would have been a very cool story and would have set up a Crisis of Faith so it doesn't feel quite as, what's he doing here?
Yeah, so do we want to talk about making of Baron Fell next? Oh, I really liked In the Empire Service.
I really liked it too, and I wanted to mention one more thing about it. Well, at least one more thing. You remember that Y-Wing pilot who gets shot down and she loses her leg and her eye?
Yes.
And that's where Stackpole really gets to show, the horrors of war on the survivors. And she comes back later, so we'll mention her again. But I really liked how she's a loyal pilot for General Solom, and General Solom clearly cares for his people. He's like Wedge, he's a father to his men. And I love unit commanders like that who really clearly care about their soldiers, but they also are willing to get the job done and defeat the enemy.
It's also mentioned her gunner probably didn't make it out.
Yeah, and there's another pilot who probably has, horrible PTSD, and we see it zooms into his eye, and you see those interceptors from the 181st just murdering the Y-Wings. Because if you've ever flown in either the Rogue Squadron N64 games or the X-Wing games, an interceptor is incredibly nimble. It turns and is very fast, and it's got 4 laser cannons, so it's really powerful in terms of guns. It will kill things much faster than a TIE fighter with just 2 lasers. A Y-Wing is just extraordinarily slow. So even though it has decent shields, if an interceptor gets behind you, it will just murder you. It is no fun to fly a Y-Wing versus interceptors.
And there's a particularly memorable panel in this one where it's talking about stats of the Y-Wing and how it's still well-loved. And then it cuts to by Imperial pilots, and you see an interceptor getting behind one of the Y-Wings.
And they just slaughter the Y-Wings. But it's funny because Baron Fell later says, I invented this tactic, so I knew the TIE was going to do that. Yeah, there's a ton of great stuff. There's a gag in the final issue where Ibtissim and Cap Dendo, the commando leader, blow up one of the Imperial defense emplacements with explosives set on binary. So even though it's supposed to be 200 seconds, it's actually 8 seconds. So,
and Wes Jansen is there too.
Yeah, Wes is also shot down. So there's a lot of really fun, adventurous military stuff that goes on, and I appreciate that. I think it makes a reasonable amount of sense that downed pilots in enemy territory where you have functioning commando units would link up with them and help out. All right, so let's move on to the one issue making of Baron Fell, the backstory of Baron Fell. This was drawn, of course, by a couple of different artists. One of them is Steve Crespo, who I really like. He is the artist who also did a lot of work on the final issues of Mandatory Retirement. Oh, this was all done by Steve Crespo. So he's very polished. He does a really good job of making characters very appealing, and there's a lot of romance scenes because, of course, Baron Fell falls in love with Wedge's sister. What are your main thoughts about the making of Baron Fell?
I really liked it. It's got basically Fell is like Forrest Gumping his way through the Empire.
Yeah, he shows up in a lot of different things. This is what I was doing during Hoth. This is what I was doing during Endor.
He gets recognized by Vader and Tarkin while he's like only graduating from the academy, for instance. And then there's at least one more scene with Tarkin, and he tries to tell Han, Fel does later, well, if I'd been on the Death Star, maybe I could have moderated Tarkin. And it's like, you're just a pilot.
Yeah, that's quite
on the Death Star. And it is interesting that he gets sent to the 181st as punishment for something that had happened in Hut Gambit. And at that time, they're called the 180 Worst. But he whips the unit into shape while it's nominally led by later becoming a General Evir Deracote, who appears in the X-Wing books by Stackpole specifically. So it was interesting to see him. But yeah, Making of Baron Fel has, I wrote down in the show notes, more references than we can count.
Yeah, I mean, your Forrest Gump reference is very appropriate because he just goes through not just the movies, but also, of course, the Han Solo trilogy and so many other characters. I mean, Biggs Darklighter and Hobby and Tycho and Han Solo.
Hop Skip from Side Trip shows up for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, just so many references. I'm glad it's just one issue. I think it might have been a little oversized, but Stackpole uses the issue, does a really good job of just giving us what life was like sort of on the good side of the Empire. And when I say good, I mean someone who was favored by the Empire. I also really appreciate that we start with Baron Fel being a farm boy and loving his farm. Unlike Luke, who hated the moisture farm, this was lush green grain fields in Corellia. And that's very important for Vision of the Future, which we'll find out if I can convince Wraith to do an episode about it.
It'd be a long episode. But yeah, I mean, gets sent to the Imperial Academy so that he can't testify in a case being handled by Hal Horn, of all people, for instance.
So many connections. But I would stress that it's not just continuity porn. It's not just connections. The connections are there to give you like an emotional journey for Baron Fel. He really goes through as a naive young man to an idealistic fighter pilot to someone who's starting to really struggle with the position, and then he's a man falling in love with the most famous actress in the Empire, and then he struggles through the destruction of the Death Star and the fall of the Empire and the revelation to everyone. I mean, everyone could tell because of the destruction of Alderaan and many atrocities, but Endor and the splintering of the warlords and the naked power grabs really revealed to all the people in the Empire, the people at the top definitely don't care about you. And of course, in the Empire's service, the 181st is sent against the rogues unprepared, and they are slaughtered, and that is why Fel is willing to defect at the end of the story, because he knows Isard sent his men to die for her own power.
And there's even a scene where they talk by Hollow, and he tells her, "You're sending us to die."
Yes. So he's a smart guy, and he's clearly growing increasingly disillusioned with the people he serves and the ideals he holds. So I think that Stackpole does a completely convincing job of why Baron Fel is willing to turn. I'm not 100% sure if he convinces us why the rebels are willing to accept him, but you know.
Well, he is one of the best pilots alive. And, I mean, despite, like, Noreen calling him a war criminal, he's not committed war crimes.
Yeah, he wasn't part of
sense.
He wasn't part of Turfanir's detachment of the 181st, which basically destroys a civilian city so the rebels can't have it. So he's been careful, Stackpole has been careful not to have Baron Fel participate in atrocities, just straightforward military engagements.
And the New Republic does take defectors, even at this point, even later.
Yeah, which causes a lot of problems in the New Rebellion.
But yeah, there's still a lot of hostility, kind of one-sided, aimed at Fel by Narin.
Yeah, when we get to Family Ties,
yeah,
and Baron Fel joins, Narin almost punches him out, which makes sense because 2 of the rogues were killed in the Empire service.
So do we want to talk Family Ties now?
Yeah, let's do a quick talk of Family Ties. Now, Family Ties is drawn by, it's a 2-issue arc, and it's drawn by, let's see, who are artists for this one? we have Jim Hall and Drew Johnson. So I'm going to be up front. I hate the art in this arc and also in Masquerade, which are drawn by the same team. Jim Hall, I think, is awful. He makes Baron Fell look like a muscle-bound idiot with a weird beard, and he's just constantly sticking his chest out like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's awful. Drew Johnson is better, especially with character stuff. His characters are fine, but when he's drawing X-Wings and TIE Fighters, they're really bad. He puts the vanishing point where the engines converge. So if you have, of course, the engines in an X-Wing are parallel to each other, but if you're drawing them from the back or the front, they will converge towards what's called the vanishing point, which means they look sort of like they're coming out of a triangle. But he puts the vanishing point so close to the engines that it looks like the ships themselves are triangles, even though that's not how they would actually look, even if you were using the most fisheye lens possible. So Drew Johnson is just not good at the ships. And I don't say this because I dislike Drew Johnson. Drew Johnson actually drew one of my absolute favorite runs of Wonder Woman. I really love his Wonder Woman. But this was his first comics job, and you can tell it's just not good.
Yeah, the art, didn't stand out. Well, I didn't mind it too much, but it wasn't the greatest. Yeah.
I really mind because after you get that arc by Nadeau and Ensign, and then you get Steve Crespo, who's just so crisp and appealing, this just looks cartoony and clunky. The story, however, is fine. It's kind of a continuation of the making of Baron Fell in that Stackpole is able to bring in Corran Horn, his favorite character from the Rogue Squadron books, and also Ayala Wasiri and Kirtan Lure, and he has Hobby and Wes and Plur act as sort of not bumbling, but they're definitely bulls in china shops in Corellia as they try to save Baron Fell's nephew-in-law. Or maybe, no, he's just a nephew who's been kidnapped by the man who he was sent to the academy to prevent from being put in jail. So it is all connected. Stackpole does a pretty good job of setting things up and then paying them off in later arcs. This is a pretty straightforward kidnapping special, which our heroes bumble into, I would say. If you ever saw a kidnapping special on TV in the late 90s, this is the comic version of that with Star Wars.
I did like that we got actual art of Corran and Ayala, who have some very 90s cop show one-liners.
Yes, I mean, definitely Stackpole is having a lot of fun now that he's actually writing the dialogue in addition to the plots. And he's letting all his influences show. And I think it's quite fun. I also like that Ayala, unlike some of the ladies, is not constantly drawn with low-cut dresses. She's always wearing her Corsac uniform is very competent and hardcore. And when Hobby tries to hit on her, she says, "You know I'm married, remember?"
And we get the explanation of why he's bug bite in Adamar.
Yeah. Which, as I had not read these comics, when I read Adamar, I was like, what is this? When did they meet these people?
And of course, there's some ironic lines at the end, like Wes and Hobby saying, "That Corran guy, would he be a good pilot?" And the other one answers, "Him or Rogue? Not in a million years." Which,
I mean,
of course, doesn't even take 2 years.
That's definitely Stackpole leaning heavily on the irony there. Let's move to Masquerade, the second to last arc. And as I said, this has art once again by Jim Hall and Drew Johnson, and the character work once again isn't too bad, except when Jim Hall is drawing Baron Fell looking like some kind of muscle-bound hunk. But the space stuff is just not good. The Falcon is a huge ship in this one because Han and Chewie and Leia are big characters in this arc, and it often just looks so weird. because of the perspectives they choose to use. What do you think about this arc overall?
It felt a bit convoluted when I was rereading it. It's like some things could have been streamlined.
It's very convoluted, and I think that's partly because Stackpole was struggling to figure out. He broke the stories. He has maybe 1 or 2 pilots doing one thing, and then the other 4 to 6 pilots in a space battle. But in this one, he's got Tycho and Winter in a space battle, and then Rin and Tissim and Wes and Hobby basically bumbling into a bunch of pirates and accidentally finding Tycho and Winter. And then he has Wedge teaming up with Leia to meet with Pistage. It's just, you've got 3 or 4 different plot lines, and I don't think Stackpole was able to quite get all of them as memorable and why everything's happening as strongly as he was in other arcs. So I do agree completely. It is more convoluted, and the art really doesn't help.
Yeah. You do get Han Solo wearing a bolo tie and cummerbund.
And then Wedge wears these bizarre pants with all these triangle splotches on it. It's like, what is he doing?
And Fel is basically still in an Imperial uniform.
Well, that might be on purpose, because Fel does twice. Twice in this arc, Fel talks to an Imperial and says, "I'm secretly an agent." And so we're not. I think we're supposed to be like, is he an agent, or has he really defected to the New Republic?
He's wearing this when he's at like the formal event with Han, and his formal wear is basically just a recycled Imperial uniform with black and red stripes.
In general, the fashion in Masquerade is not something I'd recommend anyone wear in real life. There are definitely fun moments. I do really like Tycho and Winter and their romantic getting captured and then escaping together. That was fun, and I just like Tycho and Winter a lot.
Yeah, I'm flipping through it, and they're a great couple overall, for sure.
Oh, we forgot to mention that. So Phalis, who was first introduced in The Warrior Princess last episode, and then Avon Beerus, who is the great nephew of one of the New Republic's Provisional Council members, Doman Beerus, who interestingly is not Corellian. She is a different system. But there is a Corellian senator named Doman Beerus, and Avon mentions that because that guy appears in the Black Fleet Crisis. Avon is immediately attracted to Phalis, even though as the son of very powerful political and business people, he's been trained to always be calculating and think of the political angle, but he falls in love with Phalis quickly, and Phalis eventually returns his love, and this is kind of one of the places you see them start to get together. And also Nrin and Ibtissim have been falling in love since Requiem for a Rogue, and we really see them starting to draw a lot closer in this story too.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's this or Mandatory Retirement, but they have a lot of kind of like, is one of them going to die moments for Phalis and Avon.
That's
including okay. Yeah, they even talk about it.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to that, because that's one of the most powerful scenes, in my opinion, in the whole series. So definitely we'll talk about that. But I think that's mostly all I have to say. This really is just setting up the pieces for Mandatory Retirement to pay off, in my opinion. Like, it has its own adventure, but it's really just getting Krenel in place, getting Sate Pistage defection plotline in place, and getting Winter back connected with the squadron, because Winter has been gone since Battleground Tatooine. So she and Tycho fall in love in Battleground Tatooine, but then obviously she's been off doing intelligence work until then, and she actually asks for Tycho as her escort as part of this undercover mission. So she's been gone for several arcs, and now she's back, and she'll be back in the final arc of Mandatory Retirement. So
she get mentioned in the Empire service.
Yeah, she does get mentioned several times because Tycho is very much in love, but she doesn't actually show up.
That, I think, is like, maybe it's Tycho or maybe it's somebody else who's asking Cap, is Winter here? And they can't be at liberty to answer that.
Yeah, Cap's like, I can't tell you even if I knew. And the really funny thing is he does that like 3 times to the rogues, like in Battleground Tatooine and in the Empire service, and then the rogues get to do it to him in Mandatory Retirement, and that was very deliberate and very funny.
And he wants to get with Fleur, but we don't see if that
Fleur is
happening.
Technically married to that guy.
Wow. Yeah.
It is weird how Plur is basically just part of the squadron again after Requiem for a Rogue. She basically goes away for Requiem for the Rogue, comes back at the end, and then she's just part of the squadron for the next 4 arcs. Although I guess technically in Mandatory in Masquerade, we do see her doing some Queen stuff. So I guess she technically goes back, but then she comes right back for Mandatory Retirement. So let's move to our series finale, Mandatory Retirement. There's tons of stuff to talk about because it's, I think, one of the best constructed. I mean, you'd said when we were chatting last night that you've reread it so many times you really remember it more. And I'd agree. I've read this one a lot because I really love the art by Steve Crespo and John Nadeau, and I really love Stackpole's writing of these characters. He puts them through the emotional ringer, and it's a dark and intense and ultimately tragic but hopeful ending to this X-Wing Rogue Squadron comic series.
Yeah, I really liked it. As you were just saying, I mean, they get away at the end, but they don't achieve the mission of saving Pestage, thanks to his own idiocy more than anything else.
Well, and the cruelty of Admiral Krenel, too.
Yeah.
Krenel actually is very scary. He's not very scary in Masquerade, but in this issue, he's constantly murdering people with his mechanical hand, which is very skeleton-like. It's not like Luke's hand. It's actually just like a Terminator hand with metal bars and ball joints, and he just constantly kills people and stabs them and rips pieces off them. He's just a monster in this arc.
And I think it comes up in Isar's Revenge that actually Thrawn was the reason he lost his hand.
Oh yeah, so if you read through this and you know he was one of Thrawn's subordinates and he hated Thrawn, the first time you see him, I can't remember if it's in Masquerade or in Mandatory Retirement, but he says, "Who needs art when you can blow things up with a Star Destroyer?" And if you know that he was one of Thrawn's subordinates, you know he's like, I hate Thrawn and his stupid art stuff. I'm just going to blow things up. But of course, Thrawn was 100 times the commander that Krenel will ever be.
Yeah. So, like you said, at the beginning, Mandatory Retirement, you get to see the pilots on their downtime.
And everybody gets to do something. So Wedge and Tycho, they start by working out, and you can see this is just like a day or 2 after Masquerade because Tycho gets tortured and he's got a black eye and cuts, and in the next arc he just has a black eye and some bandages, and you see that slowly throughout. Actually, I don't think they completely heal by the end of the issue. He's still kind of beat up.
Yeah, Wes does usual Jansen thing and
tries to hit on the girl who Wedge is going to go out with,
which he doesn't know at the time, at least.
And I still say that this girl, Raina Failer, who's a quartermaster corps officer,
somebody we say is a sister who comes up later, but we can't explain it because that's a spoiler. Which I was going to mention.
Oh, that's true. It is a spoiler.
It's a spoiler for Isar's Revenge. So,
but I say she's a sister of a character coming up later.
Yeah, we'll just leave it at that.
Nrin and Ibtissim basically just walk around falling in love. Tycho and Winter do the same thing, and they meet with Baron Fell, and Baron Fell talks about how the difference between being an Imperial and being a New Republic officer now, and he has friends, whereas he didn't have as many friends before. And I like the fact that Tycho still has this instinctive he was my trainer feeling about Baron Fell. I think that's a cool relationship that you see in little ways he reacts to Baron Fell.
We also have Phaelus and Avon running.
They go skinny dipping.
That too. And then they end up having a conversation where you're really thinking one of these two isn't going to make it out. And Phaelus even says, in the bad holodramas, it's the woman who dies.
Well, and so because Avon
they've got the death flags all over the place for those two, but then it ends up being Ibtisam.
Yeah, and
in the ring.
And the fact that Avon's great aunt is on the council means that he thinks that she won't send reinforcements because it'll look like favoritism, and that is in fact something we see. Leia and Mon Mothma and Phalia and Domin Burris and Councillor Kethrathir, the Wookiee, they're all arguing about it, and ultimately Phalia is able to persuade the council that they can't send more people to help Rogue Squadron because they won't gain enough from the operation.
There's also the question of, should we just say Pestage made his bed, now he can die in it, or do we try to get him out even though he can't uphold the deal we made for him to surrender Coruscant once he's on the run?
And it's so tragic and I think well constructed that even though Rogue Squadron, literally one of their pilots gives up her life for Pestage, and the rogues suffer intensely to try and get him out, he betrays them and is rewarded by being betrayed himself. Like, he chooses the side of the betrayers and the greedy and is murdered for it. And you really don't feel bad for it because he's been so evil the whole time.
We also get return of Mirex. She shows up near the end to help get the rogues out. Has a funny scene where Wedge suggests, this is too dangerous. I'll fly the pulsar skate out. And her answer is, you think that's more dangerous than trying to take my ship?
There's a lot of really good romance scenes here. Of course, with Nrin and Ibtisam and Phaelus and Avon, and also Tycho and Winter. And Winter has a great line when Cap is trying to see if Plur wants to go out with him while they're in the middle of a mission. Winter says, "This isn't a rebellion, it's a matchmaker's cotillion." And he teases her about Tycho, and she has a great line of saying, "Tycho's a living, breathing piece of Alderaan that I don't intend to let go." And I thought that was really beautiful and definitely plays into how we see Tycho and Winter later in the Rogue Squadron books, how their shared upbringing and their grief over Alderaan's destruction and their loss of their families has brought them together, and they're really good for each other.
Yeah, and we have Myrex saying, "We get out of this, and maybe I'll let you try and set me up with one of your pilots."
Which Wedge won't take her up on for another year and a half.
You have some cute ones, so. Foreshadowing.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's any other... so the scene that you mentioned where Avon and Phaelus talk about it, it's really nice because Phaelus... Avon is very defeatist. He thinks they're all going to die, and Phaelus says, "When I like someone, that means even death isn't going to stop us." And that's very Stackpole. I mean, you see Corran and Mirek say similar things, but they end that scene saying, "The Force be with you, my love." And I thought that was a really nicely done bit, especially with Steve Crespo drawing their expressions of sadness and hope. It's a really nicely done emotional scene, and I get chills every time I read it.
And while all this is going on Seutrik, which is where Isard's Revenge, a lot of it takes place, you have Isard herself reenacting the end of Godfather 1 and killing off the ruling council.
She murders two of
saving the last one for Lusark.
Yeah. And she also mentions activating her clone, which will be very important in certain other books.
Yeah, I think, because this was something that we mentioned didn't come up in the end of the Empire Service, some woman. No, it couldn't have been her. Never mind. There's
No,
something odd where at the end of In the Empire Service, Isard has this woman kill the incompetent Imperial who'd been nominally in charge while Fel was really leading the defense, Admiral Lon Isodo. And she tells this woman, you let the rebels capture you and think you were his prisoner. But then I've been wondering if that was the woman that is seen killing off one of the ruling council members.
that might be.
And then I realized, well, it sounds like she was in it, trying to
if
get
she's
into
really
the
one of
rebels
Isar's,
by posing as a prisoner.
well,
Which
if
is
it's really,
something, an idea we'll talk about more with Iron Fist. But
but if it's one of Isar's operatives, she could definitely escape and come back to Isard, because there's 3 whole arcs between that story and mandatory retirement.
yeah, it's in the end of In the Empire Service, Isard woman like, let the rebels bring you in. It's key to Project Ambition, and then you never find out what that was.
Yeah, we don't. That's one of the big things where I was like, they really did cancel it a little earlier, and I think it's because of that Phantom Menace thing. They really wanted to start setting up for Phantom Menace. It's also possible that sales weren't good enough. We have no real idea what comic sales were like for Star Wars in the 90s. They started off really big, but this, of course, was nearly 10 years later, so we don't really know how good they were at this time. Any other comments about mandatory retirement?
I mean, there's probably a lot more I could say about it, but we're in almost an hour and a half, so it's
I mean,
really good.
Briefly, we should just say you should read this. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of spoiled it all. We did have the spoiler warning before we got into this,
right? A couple brief comments about the Rogue Squadron Handbook, which, as I said, is collected in different Epic collections and Omnibuy. But it opens with an introduction by Mike Stackpole, which gives some good information about the construction of this series and why certain arcs, particularly the first arc, were the way they were. It's only 1 or 2 pages, so it's not quite as in-depth as I would have liked. And the rest of it is mostly summary characters and ships that you've seen throughout the series. So if you've just read it and you know what's going on, seeing them again feels a little redundant. It's not something I would spend a ton of money to obtain personally. I did spend money to get the Rogue Squadron 1/2 issue, which is its own story, but I haven't bought the handbook myself.
Yeah, I was looking through the handbook, and like you mentioned, it mainly just has a 2 pages letter from Stackpole about the history of the X-Wing, which we kind of covered some of.
All right. So that brings us to the end of our after action report. And now we have our new segment, which is called Wingbooks. And this is like Wingman, only they're books that are pairs or connected in some way to the books that we're covering on the podcast. So my first recommendation, I have too many recommendations, so I'm going to squish 2 together because they're both by the same writer. There's a comic series called Checkmate, and this is written by Greg Rucka from about 2005 to 2007. I just got these trades, Checkmate by Greg Rucka, volumes 1 and 2. It's a military intelligence series, and the reason I think that it's really connected to something like Rogue Squadron is at this point in the series, and there was some of this in things like Battleground Tatooine, you would start each issue with like a row of portraits of the pilots saying Commander, Wedge Antilles, and it would give maybe a couple details about their rank and where they're from. And this story is about DC Universe, so the same company that owns Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman. It has a spy agency called Checkmate, and it's ruled or managed by people they call royals. So there's a black king, a white king, a black queen, a white queen, black and white bishops, black and white knights, and then a bunch of pawns. And at the beginning of each issue, you have that same layout. So it has that same sense of military structure and order and who's responsible for what and what their function are. And that military unit sense of structure and everyday feeling. So they're not like Luke Skywalker or Superman, the chosen one heroes of the universe. They're just ordinary military dudes with ranks and histories and paid time off. It's got that lived in feel that I love about the X-Wing series that really digs into the more normal characters of the Star Wars universe. So if you like X-Wing, the comics, I definitely think you'd like Checkmate, the comics by Greg Rucka. And Greg Rucka also wrote some stuff for Star Wars, particularly the book Before the Awakening, which was a trio of very short novellas set right before The Force Awakens, and it came out right before The Force Awakens. And one of those is about Poe, and is basically one of the closest things we've gotten to X-Wing in the Disney Star Wars universe. So 2 things by Greg Rucka. Don't recommend Shattered Empire by Greg Rucka. It's not very good. But these 2 things, I think, really would appeal to you if you like the X-Wing series. Wraith, what's your recommendation this week?
I would say Lost Stars, just from the list we had, which is a novel, I think technically young adult in Star Wars canon, that features 2, at first they're both Imperial pilots, man and woman from the same kind of outer rim planet that really benefits once the Empire comes in. And one of them ends up defecting to the Rebels, so you see, kind of following the path of the original trilogy, Wedge shows up for a bit, and unsurprisingly, with it being the man and the woman from the same planet, there's a bit of romance that develops, and it's got that similar theme of, do you keep serving the Empire? Do you switch sides? How do you deal with what you did for the Empire when you're done? Those sorts of things. And I'd like to see it get a sequel at some point.
Yeah,
but that was published like early in Disney canon, so it's been a long time since then.
It was published, I think, right after The Force Awakens, and Claudia Gray has written a ton of stuff for Star Wars since then, both in that Bloodlines novel, which is also a prequel to Force Awakens, and the High Republic. She's done a ton of books for that. So unfortunately, I think that they're not interested in doing a sequel to Lost Stars, which is a real shame because it's one of the best things Disney's published for Star Wars. And because it's about these 2 TIE pilots, one of whom becomes an X-Wing pilot, I definitely would agree. It really does connect to that X-Wing feeling. Plus, you've got the romance, which the X-Wing novels are famous for having a lot of fan favorite romances.
And these comics we were talking about had a lot of that.
Yes. So that's our Wingbooks. Check them out. Definitely worth reading. Get them from your library, buy them from your local bookstore or Amazon or wherever you want. That brings us to the end of our episode. I thank you for listening. And until next time, keep your books locked in reading position.